Breathe in deeply through your nose and exhale through your mouth. As you breathe in, notice that God is within. As you breathe out, notice that God is all around. Notice that God is above you. Sometimes it's helpful to reach up to notice that. God is beside you as you bring your hands down to your side with your palms up. You can turn them over if you want. God is below you, holding you in all creation. Breathing in, breathing out. God within, God all around. You are above us, O God. You are within. You are in all things, yet contained by no thing. Teach us to seek you in all that has life, that we may see you as the light of life. Teach us to search for you in our own depths, that we may find you in every living thing.
There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Sometimes I feel discouraged, and I think my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm love of Jesus. He died to save us all. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sick soul.
I did a little looking up of the word Gilead, and you sent me to Genesis 31, and it's Gilead is a heap of rocks. It's interesting, as Ben talked in his sermon today, Ebenezer being a rock that we've used as a symbol for Lent this year. This heap of rocks was the agreement between Laban and Jacob, as Jacob left Laban, in an agreement that was decided between the two of them, which provided for balm in their two lives together. I'd like to remind us of some of what we chatted about last week. This was in relationship to when you faced pain, was there a strength that was born? I think Ben was the one that talked about inside out. To live life well, joy and sorrow are invited to be friends. And then someone talked about sweetness and bitterness can build strength. I was talking earlier before some of you were on that we were part of a memorial service yesterday, and it was interesting. The ones who probably spoke most truthfully about the person who had died were the daughters. In part, their bitterness was their dad was gone a lot, and it was difficult in their being raised when he wasn't there, and then when he came home and wanted to take over. So he was usually gone 6 months out of the year for a while. But through the years, they've been able to put together both the sweetness and the bitterness of that time, and strength came. When I'm not able to see someone I love, there is sadness. Compassion and empathy are born out of pain. When mother and wife experience cancer, the role we play is to build and support. Someone brought out the affirmation that prayer brings strength as we lay our petitions before God. Strength is oftentimes found outside of myself, in friends and God. People who end their lives because they do not feel love. I think Joel was the one that referred to Vesper time, the seasons of life, different ways to think about life as we grow older. So I just wanted us to kind of bring us back to where we were last week. I want you to meet Carl Jung. We all know who he is. He's a well-known psychologist, psychiatrist from Switzerland. And it would be interesting, a man, I changed it to person, a person who has not passed through the inferno of his or her passions, has never overcome them. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. I think that insight is helpful to some extent as we look at a balm for our wounds, which is our focus today. This is another quote by Eddie Hillesum. She's kind of the primary person that we, and whose story we hear in this book, A New Ancient Harmony. This is a quote. "There was a moment when I thought I would never laugh. But walking through the crowded camp, I realized again that where there are people, there is life." As I heard that quote and listened to it in my heart, I also thought that doesn't always happen. Sometimes we are caught in fear and choose an easy response. We choose to act in a similar fashion. We sometimes live out the unresolved trauma of our life. I know I have experienced that. Probably most real in family life. I've also noticed it from time to time in relationships that I've had with friends and people in congregations. This gets to the invitation I think that this book really gives to us throughout it, is that we are created in God's likeness. And this is all people. I think Pastor invited us to notice that today as we struggle with the results of last week in Atlanta. And we all are caught in thinking our likeness is more akin to God than all people's likeness is akin to God. And so once again, Eddie invites each of us to destroy within ourselves all that we think we need to destroy in others. That reference was made already earlier. And then she invites us to think about reclaiming areas of peace within ourselves. And then, she says, we are willing to act as balm for all wounds. So as we think about that word, a balm for all wounds, it happens because of our willingness to look at ourselves and our wounds and to work on them so that we might be persons who can attend and listen to the wounds of others. Carl Jung, in the book, Newell shared this about him. Woundedness is everywhere. And he really wanted to emphasize that it's both personal and collective. We know that in today's world. But he says it even more specifically and in ways that we may not have thought about before. He says it's in the cells of our souls and the atoms of the universe. And the cells of our soul and the atoms of the universe, they cannot be separated. It is always the case that a personal challenge shows forth in the world's collectiveness and brokenness, the world's collective brokenness. In New Harmony, Indiana, there's this garden. It's called Carol's Garden. And Newell talks about it in his book. It's in remembrance of the child of Jane Owen. And as he talks about the one and the many, the personal and the collective. And the invitation to see it as one and not as separate entities, but one. So he talks about God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. He goes on to say that in whatever life we gaze, then there is the heart of God. And there also is the suffering of God. So the question that I have for us as we begin today is to think about, how do we seek wholeness? So that's my question for us today as we begin. In your own life, what has been your experience in seeking wholeness? Would anyone like to share?
I think one of the things for me has somehow been, and I'm not always sure how this happens, to have permission to enter into that journey towards wholeness. Sometimes it might be becoming aware of where I'm not whole. Sometimes sort of coming to the realization, or the awareness, I guess, not the realization, but the awareness of what's happening in whatever I might be suffering. But there has to be, and always it's with God's help, to allow myself to step into that journey. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's a God-given also permission. Or reassurance.
For me, I think of reaching in to my God spark and also reaching out. So that's the concept of uncovering what God's plans are for me. And in my pain or anxiety or suffering, I look to spiritual music for answers or to spiritual art. And then, of course, to God's holy word. And that for me is how I try and seek the wholeness of where I can go to relieve that pain and that suffering.
Thank you.
For me, I would say maybe two places. One is by seeking out the stories and histories of people with whom I'm not acquainted. So world histories. But the second one has been to be more honest and open with the struggles that I face in my own life. And I have found that, if I can share my burdens with God and with my family and friends, my church folk, it's much easier to find healing from my wounds.
Thank you.
I know I sought wholeness after after my wife died, and it's sort of my whole world, fell apart, and it was very simple. It was just by saying yes over and over to everything that kind of came along, and I don't know how to put it together, but the gift was I didn't lose faith at all. I missed her horribly, but I just was guided to say yes, do this, go there, be there, keep going, do things. And it helped with my wholeness.
Have you ever been in the middle of an encounter when you are having a struggle with whatever is going on? Perhaps it's with another person, maybe an acquaintance, maybe not. And you know when you are in the midst of that you need to change course.
Yeah, could you clarify that idea a little more about changing course?
Well, I usually find for myself that I had a hard time backing away from my point of view. That I thought, it's kind of like, it's the old adage, you're so right, you're wrong type of thing. I don't know if you know, have you ever heard that adage before?
No, but I certainly have experienced the importance of being able to understand the other person's point of view and to realize the relationship is more important than being dead right. You know, you can be dead, you're so right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's but the point. That's the adage, that you're dead right. You know, you have the right of way, but you took it and you're dead.
Right.
I think that's, you know, and but the dynamic there is it possible to back? Is it possible to stop and to say, I'm going down the wrong road?
Well, it's for me, it's always a question of saying, I'm trying to live by things I figured out in the past and that I think are matters of moral principle. And when is it really the most healing, the most wholeness providing course of action to change what you've decided and what you think is right? And how do you know? What is your guidance in knowing what you should do? The older I get, the more I seems like I need more time to think things over and not let momentary emotions make me say, okay, I'm tired of this tension, so I'm going to do something here to get out of this situation. So I think your personal stress on meditation, I think, very helpful to learn to keep these passing thoughts sort of in relationship to each other and be able to weigh them and kind of come to some deeper wisdom.
When I'm been working in my journey on a particular way of, when I'm in a place of healing or being aware of some of my behavior, which is contrary to the way I want to live God's life. And if I find myself in a situation where that behavior is the behavior that I am at the moment, when the awareness comes to me that I'm in that place, then I can sometimes somehow say to myself, if there's something that happens that I can speak to myself where then I can move into the way in which I really truly wish to be with that person. It's not easy, but every time I do it, the awareness comes faster and it gets a little easier to move into that place. But first, I have to become aware and acknowledge that part of me and begin that healing process of that before I'm able to do that.
I think someone else want to say something? I think part of what I would hope for us to gain from this chapter is the invitation is to hold both together. I mean, we can be informed by that which separates and that which is life-giving. And so how do we do that in a way that's life-giving? I mean, part of the dynamic that I used on the front end was, when you see or experience someone with whom you disagree with. Eddie Hillesum invited us to think about in ourselves, what is it in me that's speaking that word that needs transformation? And that, like Clark said, as we get older, and I don't want to say that, we do use that language, that as we get older, there is seemingly perhaps a little more wisdom that we may be able to step back from reacting. Yeah.
I'd like to ask Annalisa if she could say a little more about something she said last week or the week before, precisely on that point, that we see things in other people we dislike, and then we realize that we have that quality too.
Mm-hmm.
And my tendency is to say, well, I love myself in spite of that, so I should be able to love that other person in spite of that, and take the person as a whole, and as with good and bad parts, but overall someone that should be appreciated. So Annalisa, yeah, can you say a little bit more? Because when you brought that up, I was quite struck by that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that my awareness of that must have come from Carl Jung, and I just hadn't connected the dots back in my memory. I think the first time that I really thought about this was when I was in counseling while I was a new graduate student, and I was talking with my counselor about something that I was really struggling with, and I was feeling very judgmental towards a certain group of people. And he very wisely said, well, what is that within you that you haven't come to terms with about your own brokenness, that you are, deflecting that anger towards this group of people? And so, it really sparked a lot of work for me in seeking that wholeness, so that I could see that, I'm no different from anyone else, and the struggles that I see in other people are also going on, or are capable of going on inside of me. I think that was where that thought originally came from.
Yeah, for me, it's been very important, because my father, the German side of him, was very much rule oriented, and I wonder to what extent Lutheranism is a reaction against that sense that you're supposed to always live up to some standards that are so demanding. But that for me, it's important to think, well, even though people make mistakes, do things they are sorry about, we're still good people. God still loves us, and so we should try to do everything we can to see the divine, the good in other people. So I guess I try to recognize what's wrong in them is wrong in me sometimes, but that we're both good. It's all good.
I was thinking of perhaps it was my catechism I went through when I became a Lutheran after abandoning a Baptist heritage, or maybe it was just Pastor Ben mentioning to me that Luther's argument in his theology was that when you encounter other people, always give them the benefit of the doubt on the positions that they're advocating. Don't interpret them negatively to start with. Give them the most positive reading you can, and then correct for that as you get more information. And I think that kind of is is a really healthy way to approach the world, because right now we're in an environment where all we do is snap to negative judgments about everything. And I also thought, you know, so much, having studied Luther's theology, so much of Luther's theology is about not having the easiest answer for anything. So Luther is a guy who makes things more complex by arguing that everything is paradoxical, everything has complexity and forces at odds within it, like fully justified yet sinner, right? Only by grace, only by scripture, right? It's always, but obviously that itself is a paradox. And human beings as both sinful and redeemed. And when I start thinking about what that how that speaks to me, I start to realize that before you do anything or before you pray a prayer, you've got to recognize that what our tradition tells us is life is not easy, and it can't be reduced to such simple little things. Bill Keyes's comments about Jung's insights, I think, ring really true in some ways with Lutheranism, which is that it's just much more complicated. And there's no easy answers. And anybody who gives simple answers or certain answers to everything, you got to take it with a grain of salt.
Joel, I'm delighted you remembered that idea of giving people the benefit of the doubt. That's Luther's understanding of the commandment to not bear false witness.
Yes, that was it. And I want you to know that I don't know if Linda's going to do this, but I want you to push her on it. When I die and I'm buried, and if I'm not cremated, I want my headstone to say, he occasionally gave other people the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
Well, let's move on. Thank you for your input. This has been helpful.
Well, yeah, Bill, I do want to add one thing that I feel strongly about, and that is our society has sort of chosen what you could say is the lesser of two evils. That is that the highest authority is law. And that's better than the highest authority is a dictator. But then you get a society where lawyers make all the big decisions for powerful organizations. And so everything is a bunch of rules, assuming that everybody's going to do bad things. So anytime you go anywhere outdoors, there are all these signs saying, don't do this, don't do that, all these things that would never occur to me to do. and we live in this society of it's assuming that everybody is a threat to us. Yeah. And we should automatically assume the worst of everyone, yeah, rather than think the best of them. And I think we have to push back against that self-centered, that selfish desire to protect oneself as though our fellow man is something bad.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking from a political perspective, I think that we right now live with this partisan reality where the left is more rule oriented and the right wants to be more, have a misunderstanding of the word freedom. So I think that that's a huge challenge that we live in today, because the left can be consumed with doing everything the right way. And the right doesn't want anything to control them. Now, that's my perception. It's perhaps.
Well, I would agree. We need to be in between those two things.
Yeah.
So this week, getting together with the Colahans here, I mean, so we sort of talk about we laugh about the excesses of political correctness, and on the other hand, the excesses of dictatorial passions.
Right. So what does wholeness look like? Do any of you know this picture on the right? Anybody have a clue?
I would guess it's a part of the Berlin Wall.
No?
No?
Anybody else? That's okay.
The Holocaust Memorial in
No,
DC.
no. That's okay. Anybody else want to gander a guess?
Well, I'm guessing it's a modern art museum.
It actually is Ground Zero. If you go to the museum, this is one of the things you see.
Oh, interesting.
So this is, that's one of the left, I don't know what you call those things, you know, foundations of the building. And then, so it's down in the belly of where the trade towers were, is where you are here. Then you see that little black portion, there are people, they have a walkway for people to come down to this area. But anyway, I use this image only because wholeness doesn't mean you smooth over the wounds. Resurrection isn't about wounds being undone, for they are an inseparable part of a new beginning. Jung says wholeness is about integration, not perfection. All parts of life, including the brokenness. So for me, that's an important element to remember as we think about being balm for all wounds. So we're going to kind of end today with some of the stories, and you may remember some of these stories from the book. I want to focus first on the picture on the right side. Carol and I were involved in a program with John Philip Newell some years ago. I think it was maybe in 2009, not sure, but we were at an event up in Lake Tahoe, and we worked with a woman that we'd gotten to know through Bread of Life in Sacramento. And this was all new to me, but this picture here is a picture, and I wish I could remember how the question was framed, but we were invited to put something on the kind of the rectangular square pieces. I would suspect perhaps they related to things that we maybe deeply valued, and they were maybe not destroyed, but there was a problem with it. And then maybe the yellow, which is the worldview of the Celtic cross. This is the Celtic cross, just as were hopes. And anyway, that's to explain the image there. But this image came from St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Oklahoma City. And when there was the Oklahoma City bombing of the, trying to think the name of the Muir building, the federal building in downtown Oklahoma City back in 1995. This is the kind of the diocese cathedral for the Episcopal Church there, and this cross, the whole building was terribly damaged. They put millions of dollars to reconstruct it, but this cross was damaged. It was on top of the building, and what they did is they took this cross, and when they did the remodeling or the reconstruction of the church, it was built into the wall of the church. And I went looking for a picture for it this last week, and I couldn't find it. They had all other kinds of things. They have a beautiful garden that was built up out of the results of that devastating event back in 1995. but the point of it is, it's when you talk about harmonizing, a lot of times we like beautiful music that harmonizes very beautifully, and yet sometimes harmonization is not that. When you bring things together that are at odds with each other. And yet, like Jung says, we are invited to integrate all that is, including brokenness. Love and brokenness are invited to be kept together. So that's one of the stories that he shared in the book that I thought was really helpful as we think about this imagery of being balm for all our wounds. John Philip Newell says, when we weep for those we love, we see something of their diamond essence glistening forth. And when we weep, we see that the hard edges of life have become blurred, and we begin to see differently. I was thinking about these three women who are now our children's age. They're older. They're all older, I think, than our children. So they're in their 50s. But as they were sharing yesterday, the youngest, who would be about a little older than our daughter, shared this book that her father had taken with him to Antarctica. He worked at the Antarctic for a number of years and was gone for 6 months out of the year. And she gave it to him because, I think it was an invitation for her to hear from her dad because he wasn't home. And she didn't know what the other two sisters shared their story. And so she shared this book and she didn't know what else to share. But I think we were all weeping as we listened to this sharing of this book that was probably written when she was maybe 9 or 10 years old. And I think that that's really a great metaphor that we see here, is that when we weep, the hard edges of life become blurred and we begin to see differently. And then John Philip Newell goes on to talk about balm for woundedness when he shares the story about going into this Catholic cathedral in Dublin. As he sat down and he heard the choir singing, "Comfort, comfort ye my people," and he was unprepared for it. And he just began to sob. I don't know if you've ever experienced that in life. If you notice the depth of losses in life, when there's particular music, I think, Margaret, you mentioned that earlier. But part of this is about the struggle that he experienced in Northern Ireland. He begins part of the story by talking about his joke against, and I can't think of the name of the person, maybe some of you can remember that name, from Ireland, who was a key person in the signing of the agreement between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And nobody laughed when he told the joke because they were living in the context of this paradox of these two countries that had been separated and fighting for so long. The community that helped to bring healing is a group called Corrymeela Community. And the invitation of that community is to invite people to transcend divisions. And once again, Newell says, only to the extent that we are in touch with our brokenness, both personal and corporate, will we be a strong presence of healing for others. This is another story that he talked about, and this is the story of Nora and Eduardo. They came from Honduras. Actually, Nora came to Canada because of fear for her life. And this was after her husband's death. And while she's in Canada, she meets a man who worked for the agency that was part of the death squad that killed Eduardo. And the story in the book shares how she had to run out of that space because she had so much pain in relationship to that. And yet that was worked through. And then Eddie Hillesum says, if we should survive without bitterness and without hatred, then may we have a right to have a tiny bit of say. And her last written words were on a postcard that were remarkably found as she threw it off the train. And the card said that a farmer found and sent it to the place it needed to go, I think in Holland. We left the camp singing. So how do we encourage ourselves and others in the work of not dividing when life is divisive? And that's kind of the question that I'd like to end with today. What balm have you brought to division? Anyone want to share?
I've strived to bring the balm of listening before speaking.
Yeah, I think going off of that, seeking to understand before being understood.
And I think that brings the balm of acceptance of the other. For who they are, not who we wish they would be.
The one thing that comes to my mind is teaching at a liberal arts college, which says it's in the New England tradition. I was teaching many Mexican American and other Hispanic children, young people, who were very bright, and explaining what I had learned and what I appreciated about their own culture to make them value their family and what their roots are.
I can remember a time quite a few years ago when there was a family member and we were at odds with each other. And it seemed as though things were not improving. And finally, I think in part at the coaxing of my wife and recognition of myself that counseling was needed. And I would say that the results of that brought I'm trying to think of a good word. Brought the kingdom of God in some ways into real time. Confession and forgiveness. Anyone else? I'd like to close with this prayer. It's a prayer from John Philip Newell. The truth has been inscribed into our hearts and into the hearts of every human being, there to be read and reverenced. Thanks be to you, O God. That there are ways of seeing and sensitivities of knowing hidden deep in the palace of the soul, waiting to be discovered, ready to be set free. Thanks be to you. Open our senses to wisdom's inner promptings, that we may give voice to what we hear in our souls and be changed for the healing of the world. That we may listen for the truth in every living soul and be changed for the well-being of the world. So next week, we will have the first chapter of part 3, the new harmony. And if I can find the title, which I can't remember right now, I think here it is, A Pearl of Great Price. We'll be looking at that for next week.
And could I also announce, Bill, if you're going to pick up a book at the church office, could you do that before Wednesday at noon? Because what I want to do is return any unused copies back to the publisher for a refund. So those are in the church office. You can pick them up Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday during regular business hours, and Michael will take your cash or check.
Thanks, Joel. Blessings on the rest of your day.
And on yours.
Thank you.
Blessings to you all. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you, Bill.
everybody. Thank you,
Yeah.
Bill.
Thank you, Bill.